With today's discussion of Plato's Crito, we're going to get started on the subject of civil disobedience, which is going to occupy us for the next couple of weeks. And this subject is going to lead directly into our paper. So the more you can spend reflecting and thinking about the material and trying to pull this together, you'll be in better shape when we do come in a couple of weeks to start thinking seriously about the paper, the 3 to 5 page paper that we have to write. Now, the full version of this dialogue is in course readings, in course documents. In the textbook we have a shortened version of the Crito, and it has everything that we need for our purposes largely. When we come to the paper, you'll probably want to have the full version available as well, and that's in course documents. And there's other resources that I'll tell you about on civil disobedience there as well. So today let's try and get an overall view of the Crito, and let's try and get a sense of what Plato was trying to do, and the sense of Socrates that we get in this argument. And so we'll talk about that, and we'll talk together about it when we return. So this dialogue is situated directly after the Apology. So it takes place after the Apology, which we looked at right at the beginning of the course. And we remember from the Apology, Socrates was sentenced and was executed. He was sentenced in the Apology, and the sentence was execution, and so his awaiting execution when the Crito takes place. So whereas we see the trial in the Apology, what we see in the Crito is Socrates waiting for the date of execution. So he's been sentenced and is awaiting trial. So we want to, and the first thing we'll do is we'll talk about the relation between the Apology and the Crito. And some people think, as we'll see, that there's a tension between these two texts, that the relation between them isn't as straightforward as it might appear to be at first glance. And we need to try and reflect on this relation, and perhaps the light that it sheds on Socrates' views as a whole, insofar as we can see differences between the two texts, perhaps, or things that are emphasized in the Apology that are not emphasized in the Crito, or the other way around. So let's begin by having a look at that, and then we'll take a close textual look at the Crito and make sure we're well prepared to talk about this text in due course. How does the Crito compare to the Apology then? Let's recall Socrates' claim rather in the Apology that the real danger in life is not death but living wrongly or badly. Now that comment, I think, may help us to understand why Socrates refuses to escape from jail in the Crito. Because what is happening, obviously, in the refusal to escape from jail is that Socrates is effectively condemning himself to death. If he doesn't escape, then he's going to stay and he's going to be executed. So insofar as in his claim in the Apology that it's not death that we need to fear, it's living wrongly or badly, we get an understanding, we get an idea of why Socrates, the kind of person that Socrates is, of why he would choose death over doing something that he takes to exemplify living badly, that he would equate to doing the wrong thing. So this really substantiates it. It backs up what he does in the Crito, that he tells us that that's what we really have to avoid. And look at the idea of the courageousness of Socrates that we get here, his courage, which is not based on simply, it's not the same courage of somebody who is afraid but can overcome that fear. It's almost like Socrates is telling us that it's irrational to fear death. And in fact, we know that he does say that at the end of the Apology, that because we don't know what death is like, we shouldn't really fear it. We have no good reason to fear it. We shouldn't fear death, but it's doing the wrong thing, living badly, that Socrates tells us we should fear. On the other hand, in the Apology, Socrates calls himself a gadfly, and we talked about that before, and he stresses his role as a critic of the society, of a critic of Athenian society. Now, can we say that the Crito presents us with a different aspect of Socrates' relation to his society? In the Apology, we see the role of a critic which is very much foregrounded, that he is calling, almost exhorting his fellow citizens to re-examine themselves. As he says famously there, the examined life is the only worthy one. The unexamined life is not worth living, as Socrates puts it. Now, in the Crito, something different seems to be happening, in the sense that here is the person Crito who comes and sort of tries to persuade Socrates to leave, and Socrates seems to tell us that his commitment to the city of Athens, his commitment to uphold the laws, means that he couldn't possibly take it upon himself to go along and to escape. So here it's something, rather than being a critic of society, it's almost as though here Socrates is defending society's right to hold him accountable, to hold him responsible. And remember, even as we know from the Apology, he doesn't think that he's done anything wrong, but still Socrates defends his society's right to hold him to account, to judge him, and to punish him. So it's a completely different emphasis being placed here, and we can talk about whether it's a difference of, it's actually they're incompatible. In other words, that the Apology is in conflict with what he says in the Crito. Some people do believe that. But there's definitely, at the very least, there's a difference of emphasis. So in the Apology we get the critic, in the Crito we get somebody defending the rights of the laws to punish, to judge, and to hold accountable. That seems to be very different. And one thing we're going to have to think about is what exactly is Socrates saying that society has a right to expect from him, or in what way does society have a right to assert and to defend itself against its critics? That's something very important, and it has, I think, some very interesting contemporary resonances as well. So let's try and explore that a little bit. We're all familiar with this with this sentiment, I think, expressed in different forms, but this is one of the most popular expressions. America, love it or leave it. And it's another way of saying, you either defend your country's decisions, you're either nationalist and you're patriotic, and you defend the decisions made by your country, and you defend its you defend its way of life. Or if you don't do that, then you forfeit your rights as a citizen. If you don't go along, then you have no right to criticize. You should either just leave or hold your peace. But if you're a member of the country and you're a citizen, then you should defend the decisions made by that country, and you should cease. You should desist from criticism about your country if you are a genuine patriotic citizen. Then you don't attack what your country does. Now, thinking again, like we were saying about the Apology and the Crito and the relation between them, what would Socrates think about these sentiments? And if we take the stance in the Apology and the Crito, where in the Apology we get Socrates as a almost relentless critic of his country, of his society of Athens, somebody who very much called people to re-examine the way that they were living and called them back to rethink their way of life. And at the same time, in the Crito, he shows how much respect he has for the city of Athens, of which he is a part. So Socrates seems to suggest that being a harsh and relentless critic and loving your country to the extent of being willing to die for it, that's the outcome of the decision that Socrates makes. Those two are not incompatible at all. They're in fact the same thing. So we're not faced, if Socrates is right, it's a false choice to suggest that one should love it or leave it. In fact, Socrates would tell us, I think, that both of those two, that's a totally false choice. That if you do have that attachment to your country, then you will be a relentless critic of it. And we can think of that in terms of, that you want your country to realize ideals, or you want it to fulfill itself, and so you can sort of be attached to it or to the ideals that it represents, and of course be critical of the way that as currently as decisions are currently made, or as people are currently living, and thus falling short of those ideals. So there are definitely ways to reconcile that, and it's interesting to think again about how Socrates, what Socrates' stance is, and how sharply it contrasts with this idea that, being loving your country, being patriotic, is the same thing as not being critical. Completely different thing. All right, now let's get on to taking a close look at the arguments of the Crito, and let's see if we can figure out what how Socrates is being portrayed by Plato here. And again, like I said at a previous point, I don't want to get into the question here of how much is Plato and Socrates. We'll keep that in the background. I'm not going to raise that issue here, but let's assume as we go forward that these are Socrates' arguments that are being put forward by being reported by Plato in the Crito, and we'll try and take a look at them on that basis. Right. So at the beginning of the Crito, we get Crito's arguments, and the upshot of it is this is one of the significant passages, and there's one other when Crito is essentially trying to persuade, to entreat Socrates to take his advice and to escape from his imprisonment. And there's a number of things that Crito mentions in order to try to persuade Socrates to do as he wants him to do. And here you can see that he's emphasizing his own status as a friend, and he's saying, Socrates, I will feel terrible because I will lose a friend if you don't decide to escape now. If you're killed, it'll be very bad for me. I'll lose you as a friend, and even worse, people will think that I was a terrible person because I didn't try to make you escape. I didn't convince you to escape, I should say. So you can see that the focus of these arguments is very much on Crito. And how he will be perceived and how he will feel. How he will feel if Socrates is put to death. And I think that gives us a very important clue about why these arguments are not likely to persuade somebody like Socrates. They're very emotional appeals. It's an argument which is saying to Socrates, look, I want you to feel bad about not escaping. I want you to feel, I want you to sort of, I'm appealing to your emotions, and I want you to feel bad about this decision that you're taking, and I want you to reevaluate it on that basis. So it's an emotional appeal. It's something which tries to get Socrates to feel a certain way, to feel a certain way about a decision that he's going to make. And as we'll see, let's take a look at that. Socrates is very clear that this is not an adequate basis to take decisions, and certainly not the basis on which one should take a decision of this magnitude and of this importance. Socrates is very clear that the important thing is to act according to reason, to act on the basis of a principle. His response to Socrates, in a nutshell, is that he says, I cannot put away the reasons which I have before given, the principles according to which he has lived his life. In other words, the principles which I have hitherto honoured and revered, I still honour. And unless we can find other and better principles on the instant, therefore we shouldn't do anything else. So, the idea is, according to Socrates, that we continue to uphold principles, acting according to principle. And acting according to principle is a very different thing from responding in an emotional way. Why? Because principles are things that we can apply to all kinds of cases. Principles we can generalize. It's not just this case, it will apply to a whole series of cases, and it doesn't matter how the person feels. If you act according to a principle, then you act according to something that is right. You don't just follow whatever emotions you happen to have on a subject. So Socrates insists that his decision must not be based on personal interest or on convenience, but on a general, justifiable principle. And that's the central distinction that he makes here. Crito wants to appeal to Socrates' personal interest, and he mentions his family and his children and all of these things. Socrates says, no, we have to act according to a general principle that we can justify according to reason. Now, Socrates insists on a very important difference between doing evil and suffering evil, and this is something that runs throughout the whole of writings on Socrates that we get from Plato. All of them insist upon this distinction between doing evil versus suffering evil as an important principle, really, for understanding Socrates. And it's clearly articulated in the Crito. So let's take a look at that and how that's supposed to work. Now here's the quote where Socrates says, are we to say that we are never intentionally to do wrong, or that in one way we ought and in another way we ought not to do wrong? Or is doing evil always evil and dishonourable? And of course Socrates believes that the answer is, as stated in the second part, that doing evil is always wrong and is always dishonourable. So there's a belief on the part of Socrates that it's always a worse thing, it's always worse for us to do evil than to suffer evil. Now, the way to understand this, I think, and this makes it very clear what's at stake, is that if we do evil, then in fact we are the ones who are the active agents. And so if we're doing evil, then the action reflects on the quality of our soul. The action reflects on our character. So for us to actually do evil, it means that it's not simply something that happens to us. It's a decision that we have taken to do a particular action. And because it's a decision, it means it stems from the nature of our character. It stems from our sort of deeper selves, if you like. It's who we are. Now, if you contrast that with the idea of suffering evil, okay, now, of course, and we've talked about this before, lots of unpleasant things can happen to us. We can suffer bad things in all sorts of ways. For example, earthquakes and tsunamis, natural evil that we talked about. Or, of course, we can suffer evil at the hands of other people. But none of this corrupts our soul in the same way. You know, it doesn't reflect on us as people. It doesn't mean that we are somehow bad people because we suffer things at the hands of others. So it doesn't reflect on the quality of our soul. It doesn't reflect on our character as people. So there's a very important distinction, Socrates says, between doing evil, doing something which is bad, or suffering evil. Okay? And as much as possible, and even if these things should be as sort of, greatly apart as possible, so that we could do a little bit of evil, right? Maybe, tell a smallish lie in order to avoid, terrible consequences of suffering awful things, right? The kind of trade-offs where if you do something a little bit bad, you can prevent something really terrible from happening to you or or other people or whatever. Socrates says that that's something we just shouldn't contemplate doing. That doing evil things is always far worse for us than suffering. So even when we're suffering, we're sort of being tortured on the rack or whatever, it's still, that is a better state to be in than to be in the position of doing something which is evil and dishonorable. Very important distinction for Socrates. Now, let's look at the application of this principle in the Crito. It means that even if the state is making us suffer the greatest possible evil, and of course that's exactly what happens to Socrates, because he suffers unjust imprisonment and death. The greatest possible evil that could be suffered by somebody, I would guess, we'd definitely say, is death. Even if that should happen to us, it's no justification for doing evil. That is, and let's say that these two things are the same thing, it's no justification for acting against our principles that tell us what is right and that tell us what is good. So when Socrates, voluntarily drinks the hemlock in order to, which is, a sort of poison method of execution. When Socrates drinks the hemlock, he does so knowing that he is suffering what he takes to be a great evil, but that is no justification for doing something which will be going against our principles that tell us what is right. So if you sort of extrapolate what that means, it's all about saying that to escape would be going against our principles. That would be doing evil. And so that would be a worse thing than even suffering unjust imprisonment and death. And it seems to us, I think, we're inclined to say that's a very sort of extreme principle. And in a sense it is. But I guess we could also say that, anything that counts as acting on principle, if we act on principles, then we can't pick and choose when we act on them. If something is right and it's right on principle, then even when the consequences are not going to be advantageous for us, and in fact are going to be very hard to deal with, we should still follow our principles and do what is right on principle. So it's not the sort of thing where we can sort of pick and choose. In other words, if something is right, then it's right in all cases. Now, let's take a look at the two specific arguments that Socrates gives that outline his obligation to obey the law. And of course, these two arguments are going to tell us why Socrates believes it is against his principle to escape from Athens. So these principles are going to tell us why he chooses to remain in jail, why he doesn't escape, and why he thinks that he should accept the punishment of being put to death rather than take the opportunity of escaping and going against the laws. Now there's a longish passage that's on page 615 of the text, and there's an argument here which is very important, the first argument. And in the course of this discussion, Socrates is talking about how we can think of the laws as having brought all of us into the world, of having nurtured us, and as having educated us. So these are the terms in which he talks about the laws as being like parents. So the idea is that we can think of parents as bringing us into the world and nurturing us and guiding us on all of that stuff. And Socrates describes the laws in very similar terms here, and the language is very revealing of a relationship between these two things. So the parent-child relationship, as Socrates describes it, is said to be the same thing as the law-citizen relationship. So a relationship between parents and child. Laws are parents to the position of the citizen, who are conceived as more in the position of children in the parent-child relationship. Now, if we think about this, what's being stated here, we'll see that it's something we are very familiar with, having looked at one of these also very recently, and that is an argument by analogy. An argument that works by creating an analogy between two things. And the analogy in question here is that relationship. That the relationship between parents and children is the same relationship as the law-citizen relationship. So Socrates wants to say, remember when we did the design argument, we looked at the argument by analogy in that case. Socrates wants to say that whatever holds of the parent-child relationship will also hold, therefore, of the law-citizen relationship, if they're the same thing. So just as, a parent would feel aggrieved and would feel an injustice was done if a child decided to willfully disobey a command of the parents, the laws would feel justly aggrieved and wrongly done by if citizens should decide at their whim to break a law that was set by the state. So they're supposed to be the same relationship in that respect. Now, as we know very well, an argument by analogy has to be tackled by examining the things in common and examining the points of difference between these relationships. So, like we did before, the best way to tackle an argument by analogy is try to think of points of comparison, things that these two relationships do have in common, and then to think about disanalogies, cases where the relationship is in fact not the same thing. And cases, the more that we can find things in common, remember, the stronger the argument is going to be. The more that we can find disanalogies, and the more relevant and pertinent those disanalogies are, the weaker the argument is going to be. So let's see if we can have a go at making that case here, of trying to sort through the commonalities and disanalogies here. So, to evaluate an argument by analogy, let's sum up. We make a list of the ways in which the analogy holds, and we make a list of the ways in which it doesn't hold. And the more things that we find in common, the stronger the argument. The more things that we find against, the weaker the argument. And we can sort of go through and just sort of make a list of anything we can think of really at first, and then we can get on to evaluate and saying which is really stronger. And of course the key will depend on which of the points in common or the points against, the disanalogies, most closely relate to what we're trying to prove here. Okay, so what we're really trying to prove in this argument, of course, and this is all about understanding what the analogy is doing. What we're trying to prove in this argument, what Socrates, I should say, is trying to prove, is that just as children owe obedience to their parents, citizens owe obedience to the laws. So that's the relevant relationship that we're trying to prove. That's the respect in which we're saying that things are similar. That just as parents have a right to expect obedience, so do the laws. So let's see if we can figure out and try and make a list of at least some relevant things, and I'm sure you'll think of your own things, and we'll talk about those in due course and have a discussion about this argument. But let's make a list and see what we're up with. So let's start with the commonalities. In other words, let's try and think of ways in which laws are in fact like parents, ways in which the comparison holds. Now, you might be tempted at first here to mention that, like parents, laws make rules, which is true. It's certainly true. But we can't really use this as a point of comparison here, or we can't really use this as something that supports the argument. Because what we're trying to prove here is that the rules made by laws are to be obeyed, exactly like the rules made by parents are to be obeyed. So the fact that they make rules, we're sort of presupposing that. It isn't something which strengthens, it isn't something which tells us it's a relevant respect in which they have in common. In other words, it's true, but we're presupposing that in making the analogy in the first place, so it doesn't really help us. So let's cross that one out. What else can we come up with? Well, they nurture us. Do they? Let's think about it. Well, we say that parents nurture us. We know we get nurturing from parents in all kinds of ways, from sort of materialistic things like buying clothes and providing food and that stuff, to taking care of emotional needs and things like that. Well, maybe we can say there are aspects of the laws, or more broadly, let's think about the state, which of course makes laws. Let's think about the ways in which we're sort of nurtured by the state. And of course there is some provision from, the very rudimentary sort of welfare provisions for people in poverty, to things like hospital care, to things that are certain charity care, sorts of care that are supported. So we could make that argument that there is some nurturing. And of course, the state, let's remember, has all kinds of laws to protect children as well, so that if parents are, let's say, in some way abusive towards children, then the laws exist to protect children in those relationships. So there is a sort of nurturing. There is a nurturing aspect, I think we could say, to what the state does. So that might be something we can find in common. Now, we could also say they provide education. In the case of parents, of course, a lot of it's in a non-official context. In other words, it's sort of ongoing, but definitely parents have a major role in educating their children. And of course, we have to say that the state plays a huge role in educating children as well, in providing rudimentary education, which of course is compulsory. So both of these have a role in educating children. The laws give us guidance, exactly like parents do. Parents give us all kinds of guidance, like how to cross the road, and how to put your seatbelt on, and all kinds of guiding stuff that the parents tell us, and more central stuff as well about how to live our lives, and what principles to live by, and that sort of thing. So there's more general guidance in there as well, of course. And we could say that laws give us some measure of guidance as well. If you think of laws that are meant to sort of guide us in a principled direction, think of the law that says you have to wear a seatbelt. Right? That's something that in a sense tells us there's something we have to do for our own good. And that sort of logic is exactly the kind of things that parents tell us, right? Eat your vegetables because you may not like it, but it's for your own good. Well, when the state makes laws like, which people call generally paternalistic sort of laws, when the state makes laws like wear your seatbelt, it's a similar kind of thing. It's saying you may not want to do this, but this is for your own good. You have to do it. Or in cities, a lot of towns and cities have ordinances like if you ride a bicycle, you have to wear a helmet. And again, that's the same sort of guidance. Many people would say, well, I don't care, I don't want to wear a helmet. And the laws say, well, too bad, it's for your own good, you have to wear one. So we can see that the laws have a role in giving us some sort of guidance as well. Now, this one may be a bit more controversial. In the case of the laws, we can definitely say, I think parents provide us with morals, that we get a lot of our moral outlook, a lot of our ideas of good and bad from our parents, or from our, when we talk about parents here, we can easily substitute primary caregiver, I think, for that equation, and sort of it comes out to the same thing. So we get a lot of moral guidance from our parents or caregivers, and the ways in which the laws do that, well, we've got some direct examples of that, of course, in laws about things like biotechnological research, stem cell research, and those sorts of areas, where the law, in terms of how it regulates that practice, definitely has a role in enforcing a certain moral perspective. So that the law does tell us certain things. That when there are laws that encourage things like marriage, and of course there are marriages encouraged by tax breaks, and all kinds of sort of financial goodies that you can have in virtue of being married, that again is a form of the law or the state getting involved in moral questions, assuming that some relationships are more worthy than others. So whether we like it or not, and we may not like a lot of it, but the state does have a role in enforcing a certain moral perspective. It does play a role in moralizing us as people, exactly as parents do. And of course, we could also say, I think, and this one is I think very clear, that both of them provide protection. Parents provide us obviously with the most obvious and most important form of protection when we're very young from all the kinds of trouble we could get ourselves into. Parents are the ones that are supposed to be there that make sure we don't get into any serious trouble. And of course the laws have a central role in protecting us from dangers that might happen to us as people, from internal problems, which of course the role of the police is to protect us from internal dangers, if we think of that in contrast with the military, which is to protect us from external dangers. So the laws are there to provide protection through the police and military and other institutions, and parents have a central role in protection too. So here's the deal. I think we can say they're relevant in all these respects. What does that tell us? Well, if parents demand obedience, then we might think of it as sort of a return for giving us all these things. In other words, we're provided with all these things by parents, and in return we owe them obedience. Now, if it's true as we're saying, if we're endorsing the point that the laws give us these things too, then we could make the same argument there. Because we get all of these great things from the law: nurture, education, guidance, morals, and protection, therefore we owe the law the same obedience we owe our parents. So those relevant sort of respects provide some support to the argument that Socrates' argument that parents. Alright, so let's try and turn this around, and let's look at the other side of the equation. So we made our list of ways in which they're similar. Let's make a list of ways in which they're not similar. Let's make a list of ways in which laws are not like parents. Well, this should be obvious to all of us, I think. Laws do not love us. Now, we may sort of say, well, that's, it's nice if it's nice if the parent-child relationship is like that. Maybe it's not necessary to the parent-child relationship. But I think you could say that there's definitely a closeness, or there's an emotional bond between parents and children that is just not there in the relationship between citizens and laws. So we don't have that same emotional connection. There's just no emotion to the relationship whatsoever. So that's a significant respect in which laws are not like parents, and it may be one that really damages the analogy here. Right? If the fact of being emotionally attached tells us something about the parent-child bond, which makes it possible to think that parents are entitled to an obedience which the state is not entitled to, and I think it is something important. So we'll try and bring this out. Let's think of some other disanalogies as well. Well, here's a good one. We pay taxes to the laws, but not to our parents. Usually that is, maybe there's some sort of, and maybe it depends how old we are, and I think it probably does. Obviously, when we're sort of very young, we don't pay anything to our parents because we can't earn anything. It may be that if you're over a certain age, 16 or 18, or whatever, that you in fact have some sort of contractual or not obligation to pay rent or to pay food subsidy to your parents and so on, which may be a kind of tax. Admittedly, there are those cases, but generally it's not institutionalized in the relationship in the same way. We think that and here's where it may be important. We pay taxes to the laws, which is why we get things like protection and all these other good things. But of course, it's not because we pay whatever subsidy to our parents that they nurture us and guide us and all of that sort of stuff that they do, right? So this may be an important disanalogy as well. In other words, the benefits we get from the laws we pay for, but we don't, especially when we're young, we don't pay in any sense for the great things that we get from our parents. Parents, we might say, want what is best for us unconditionally. Okay? So in other words, there's what we might call an exclusivity to the parent-children connection. That for parents, their own kids are very unique and special in a way that's not true for other kids. Now, we might not say that about the laws. I guess we could say it in a sort of general way that the state treats all of its citizens as special in relation to citizens of other countries, and so that might be true, and this argument might be sort of weaker in that respect. But it's certainly true that it's an interesting thing that something like capital punishment or the death penalty exists, where states do, in this country and some other countries, states do put their citizens to death for having done certain things. It's really difficult to imagine, I think, of parents consenting to do that. In cases where parents have killed their children, those cases that I'm aware of tend to be ones where mental illness was at stake. It's not something that I think we'd all say it's not something that parents could do dispassionately, could do in a state of sound mind, perhaps. So maybe there's something here that, and again, it's about the lack of love, the lack of emotion between the relationship between laws and citizens. It's just not the same kind of relationship, and that's exemplified in the fact that states can and often do put their citizens to death for having committed certain crimes and done certain things. And here's another way of putting it. The parent-child relationship is a natural relationship. The law-citizen one is a conventional relationship. In other words, we can think of the parent-child relationship as sort of one that's imposed on us by how we are by nature, by how we are by our natural sort of our natural way of being is to have children and to have a close relationship with those children over many years, and that's unique about us as a species, as human beings. The law-citizen relationship, we might say, is in other words, to say it's a conventional one. It's one that's created by us to serve certain purposes, but it's not. Some people would sort of disagree to some extent, but it's not natural, I think, in the same way that a parent-child relationship is natural. It's one that we create to fulfill specific purposes, and that may be a clue as to why it's not exactly the same thing, and why we cannot say what holds for one necessarily holds for the other as well. Now here I think is something very important. We only owe our parents, I think, unconditional obedience, we might say, until we are, let's say, 18 or thereabouts. In other words, the time when we come to intellectual and emotional maturity. As citizens, that is, as citizens in a relationship to the state and the laws, we are all already mature. Therefore, we do not owe unconditional obedience. And I think if it's true that we talk about, Socrates talks about how a father or a parent has a right to expect obedience from children. Well, that's true, but of course it only holds until we're able to think and reason for ourselves. Not that we can, not that we then automatically disregard everything parents and caregivers say. It's just that now we can come to our own conclusions, and our ability to reason for ourselves is perhaps respected somewhat more, although admittedly not in all cases. But as citizens, we are already in the position of maturity. As citizens, it's assumed that we can reason for ourselves, so we just can't assume that we therefore owe unconditional obedience. In other words, the relationship, and this is why this is a good disanalogy, because it shows clearly what's wrong with the argument. The unconditional obedience between parents and children only holds until maturity, right? So it holds until we're able to sort of make good decisions for ourselves. But as citizens, we're already mature. So to say that the state we owe unconditional obedience is to simply assume what is not true, that we cannot think and reason for ourselves. So think about these disanalogies and think about the analogies, and that's going to be the clue for how strong this argument is. And whether we can see that the disanalogies outweigh the analogies, or the points of comparison way around. So let's ask our question then: does this argument prove that we owe unconditional obedience to the law? Well, there are a lot of things in common. There are a lot of benefits we can say that we get from both parents and the law. But as we also saw, there are a lot of points where the precise thing that the analogy wants to prove, the precise purpose that it wants to, argument that it wants to justify, that we owe unconditional obedience, there seem to be a lot of flaws with making that assumption. So, insofar as that's the case, it's not a very convincing argument, if indeed we agree that a lot of those disanalogies do. Now, the second argument that Socrates gives us is about the social contract. And this is the argument that in leaving prison, in escaping from jail, Socrates is breaking agreements and covenants that he had already made with the city of Athens. So he's breaking his agreements, in fact. He had made an agreement to uphold the laws, and that is now being broken. We need to make a distinction here between tacit consent and explicit consent. And tacit consent is something that you do by your actions. Explicit consent is if you say, I totally agree, and I'm going to write down my agreement. Obviously, we don't do that. We don't explicitly say, write something in paper saying I'm going to uphold the laws. So there's something called tacit consent. It's agreement by our actions. And the idea is that Socrates had shown this agreement by his behavior, not by what he in fact says. So the question is whether Socrates, in virtue of being a committed citizen and active participant in public life, and remember, he didn't just reside in Athens, he was a active, very committed citizen, always knocking around the marketplace, always interrogating people, served in the assembly, all of this stuff. Does that mean that by being a part of society he agreed to abide by the decisions of the democratic assembly? That he in fact undertook a commitment to uphold the laws of Athens and to follow those laws? The essence, I think, of Socrates' argument here is that he has a choice of either persuading or obeying. In other words, the choice that we have if we disagree with something is to persuade other citizens that they are wrong. And if we cannot undertake to persuade them, or if that attempt fails, then of course the choice is obeying the collective decision. It seems to be a basic principle of sort of democratic debate here. We could say that we either persuade somebody else of our position, or we have to go along with what everybody else wants to do. And of course we could say that's what Socrates is saying here, that if you can't persuade, then you have to go along with what everybody else wants. So that's the choice. And of course in the Apology, Socrates made his effort to persuade, and of course he failed. Now here's a thing which we're going to think about in due course. What if the majority of citizens do not listen to the views of a minority, or perhaps they harbor a prejudice against that minority? In other words, the idea is, here we're saying, persuade or obey. That's your choice. You've got to try and persuade, or if you don't, you have to go along. But what if the reason you can't persuade somebody is not because you don't have a good argument, right? Not because your view isn't persuasive, but because, for whatever reason, nobody is listening. Maybe because nobody's going to listen to somebody like you, right? Maybe the minority has prejudices of a certain sort, whether those be racial, ethnic, gender prejudices, or whatever kind of prejudice is in question, whatever sort of divides a minority and a majority. If the minority isn't being listened to, regardless of its arguments, that's when this position, this argument, may not hold. Okay? And that's what we're going to think about when we really get into the subject of civil disobedience. And I think this is a central issue for us to try to resolve. Another way of putting that, I guess, what advice would Socrates give to a German living at the time of the Nazi government? Right? In other words, if you're dealing with a situation where those who are in control are simply not going to listen to arguments, and in fact this is a more extreme case of the scenario we were just talking about, where any hint of opposition is going to be put down immediately, so there's just no public forum to persuade. Now what this tells us, I think, is that if we're really going to evaluate and to answer this question properly, we've got to think about the social conditions, the social political conditions in a society. And we've got to figure out what those conditions are before we can answer the question about civil disobedience.
I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threat, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. You can accept it. You will leave those state troopers glutted with their own barbarity. If you can accept it, you will do something that will transform conditions here in Alabama. So I'm not worried this afternoon, however dark it may be, however difficult it may be. I know that it is true, the truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yes, sir. That is another part of that great statement. Yet that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed the earth will rise again. The Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. We shall overcome. Now let me proclaim here and now that I am still convinced that the philosophy and practice of nonviolence affords a more excellent way to improve the inadequacies existing in the American social system. The method of nonviolent resistance is effective in that it has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses, it weakens his morale, and at the same time it works on his conscience. I believe we will win it because the goal of American freedom, used and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. It is time to reorder our national priorities all those who now speak of goodwill and who praise the work of such groups as the President's Commission now have the gravest responsibility to stand up and act for the social changes that are necessary to conquer racism in America. If we as a society fail, I fear that we will learn very shortly that racism is a sickness unto death.
Martin Luther King, its view of civil disobedience is a very interesting and a very rich and fruitful one, and it draws heavily, and this is addressed in the text, it draws heavily on the writings and philosophy of Gandhi, who of course put the same idea to good effect when he was using civil disobedience against the British. Gandhi called it satyagraha. Gandhi was using a similar process against the British in India to achieve independence. And King takes a lot of Gandhi's ideas and uses them to develop his conception of civil disobedience, which he uses to apply to the civil rights movement and to use as a tactic for the civil rights movement, arguing against segregation in the United States, in the South in the 1950s through the 1960s. For King, what's important is that civil disobedience is seen as a way of creating tension, and he speaks of it as this productive tension in relation to a different sort of tension, which would be a negative tension which only spurred further conflict. Civil disobedience wants to create a productive tension which forces society to confront an issue, to confront a question which thus far it has refused to confront, as King sees it. Now he uses, and what's interesting really philosophically here is that he speaks of gadflies. He uses Socrates' idea of civil disobedience as being a way of operating as a gadfly. In other words, as raising issues that are uncomfortable to confront and forcing a society to confront questions and concerns that are uncomfortable for it to raise. Like, in Socrates' case, the gadfly, you just want to swat it away, you just want to get rid of it. You don't want to have to face those questions that are being raised by critical thinking. And in his dialogue with Athenian citizens, Socrates was also forcing them to confront the grounds of their own beliefs and forcing them to think deeply about the beliefs that they held. In a very similar way, King wants civil disobedience to force a society to confront its values and to confront how it fails to live up to its deepest values. That is the case that King sees at stake in the United States in the South in the 1960s. That here's a society that refuses to confront its beliefs and refuses to face the contradiction between what it professes to be, what the United States professes to be, the ideals that it professes to embody, and what is actually practiced. So, and he sees the same, his ideas, of course, are a very rich mix of influence of philosophy and theology and Christianity and radical thinking. And he creates this philosophical belief, this idea that very much supports and nourishes his view of civil disobedience and social action. And it's interesting, like I said, that he appeals to Socrates' idea here of social criticism as being like a gadfly. And in a sense, we can see civil disobedience, according to Martin Luther King, as being something that does at the social level what Socrates does at the level of the individual mind, which is force individuals to confront their beliefs, to raise criticisms about them, and to become open about conflicts between what you profess to believe and what you actually do. And that is what King wants to achieve with civil disobedience, which is law breaking for a political purpose. Breaking a law not as a criminal action, but breaking a law in order to achieve a political purpose. The main distinction in King's letter from Birmingham jail, the most important thing here is that he makes a distinction between just and unjust laws. And he appeals to a tradition, he doesn't explicitly mention it, but the tradition in question is the natural law tradition, which goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas. And other Christian scholars throughout history have drawn upon this tradition. And it's still very, very popular today. And the basis of it is that it makes a distinction between human law, which is law implemented by human beings. This is sometimes called positive law. In other words, it's law that is a part of the legal system of a society. It's what society tells you, this is what you can and cannot do, and this is how you're going to be punished if you do it or do not do it. Natural law is the eternal law, which is, of course, God-given law in the Christian natural law tradition. It's God-given law, and it's our awareness of that eternal law. So natural law is the awareness, the natural light, as it's often said, the natural light within human beings that allows them to become aware of the eternal unchanging law of God. Now, the distinction between just and unjust laws relies on this difference, because it associates just law with the natural law, with eternal God-given law. And it says that unjust laws are those human laws that are out of whack, that are not in accord with natural law. So unjust laws are laws that do not live up to natural law and are in conflict with it. Such is the case for King with the segregation laws of the 1960s, which he says are unjust because of what they represent and the way they divide human beings and fail to treat people equally. For King, that's a classic case of a law that is out of whack with the natural law, and as such, according to the tradition, and he quotes this in the text, it's a quote from St. Augustine, another natural law scholar, who says, an unjust law is no law at all. In other words, if a human law tells you to do something and that law conflicts with the natural law, you're to treat it as not a real law. It doesn't really bind us. It doesn't really compel us. So any human laws which are immoral, and King, of course, mentions the Nazi legal system in Germany as a classic case, any laws like that which are deliberately and obviously immoral, out of whack with the natural law, there is no moral obligation on us to obey them, and in fact, we have a moral obligation to disobey them. So that's the centerpiece of King's justification of his process of civil disobedience. Now let's look a little bit more closely at the definitions that King gives of the idea of unjust laws. There are really two parts to it. And this is the first part, and it's a distinctly religious argument. And this really draws from the fact that King's audience in writing this letter are in fact 8 members of the clergy, 8 white members of the clergy who had written to King and said that his actions, his civil disobedience, was, quote, unwise and untimely. And King is writing directly in response to those members of the clergy. And that's why the text at parts is so filled with religious vocabulary and references. It's because of the audience that he is writing for. And we see that in the religious definition of unjust laws. King says here that an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law or the law of God. It is out of harmony with the moral law. In St. Thomas Aquinas' terms, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law. Again, so there he's appealing to the natural law tradition and making that explicitly known here. Now he says, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And that's really the core of what he wants to say here, that segregation statutes and segregation degrade human personality. They degrade our sense of ourselves as persons, and so they couldn't possibly be in accord with the natural law idea of how law is supposed to treat human beings, which of course is to treat them with dignity and respect. So, and he talks about Martin Buber here, a Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, who talks about I-it and an I-thou relationship. And an I-it relationship is a relationship we have typically with things, in which we use them, manipulate them for our own purposes. An I-thou relationship is a relationship with human beings, who we can never treat instrumentally, we can never manipulate as we can, use things for our own purposes. And that is what segregation statutes do. And he mentions Paul Tillich as well, and uses a lot of references here, a lot of religious references to make his case. So it's a very rich religious argument, and it's in the text on page 625. You can have a closer look at it to go over it in more depth. But it's a bearing in mind his audience, it gives us a good idea of his moral perspective. Let's take a look at the second part of this, the secular definition. The secular argument gives us a much clearer idea of how this is to be applied. He says, an unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. A just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is willing to follow itself. Sameness made legal. So here is saying that just laws are ones that treat people equally, that don't make distinctions between people on the grounds of race. Or we could add by implication on the grounds of gender, on the grounds of ethnicity, sexuality perhaps. So these are all of the areas in which you could discriminate, in which you could treat people unequally. And King says it is no business of law to make those discriminations among people. Here we have a perfectly secular argument. It doesn't depend upon the religious vocabulary that we saw at work in the previous paragraph, but it makes the same point. It makes the same point, it just doesn't use the sort of uplifting vocabulary. But again, that idea of treating people with dignity is still the core of this position, is still the core of this argument. What's really interesting about King's position of civil disobedience is that, like Gandhi, it really underlines the idea of respect for the law. And here King is being arrested in Birmingham in 1963. And he, like anybody who practices civil disobedience, doesn't resist or try to escape the punishment. And this comes across very clearly when King says, again in the letter from Birmingham jail, one who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. So this idea of respect for law, that even though you're breaking the law, you can respect it, is very important for King's view of civil disobedience. And it goes back to the kind of thing civil disobedience is. Again, it's not an attempt to overturn the law as a whole. It's not a criticism of the system of law as a whole. It's really an attempt to say, I disagree with this particular law, but I still believe that the law has a right to punish. In other words, I'm not above the law. I still believe that I am under the authority of law. So that's why, even in breaking the law, you have to show respect for it by accepting the penalty. And that, of course, is something Socrates also endorses in the Crito. Now, in thinking about civil disobedience, and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement are, of course, an exemplary instance of civil disobedience being used to affect political change. And, of course, the suffragettes who were arguing for women's rights and demonstrating for women's rights at the turn of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, were another excellent instance of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience has been used throughout history, circumstances permitting, and I'll talk a little bit about that, to achieve political change. And in thinking about its justification, we need to bear in mind both the purpose that it's trying to achieve, and also we have to be aware of the society, the nature of the society that those engaging in civil disobedience are trying to change. By the purpose, what I mean is that civil disobedience is an action that is directed towards attempting to show that a law is morally and politically wrong, morally and politically questionable. So it's an act of breaking the law that intends to call attention to the fact that a particular law on moral grounds is considered to be wrong by those who are protesting against it. So it's an attempt to make a distinction between one law or a group of laws. In Martin Luther King's case, of course, that group of laws that established segregation, or the regulations and the practices and the customs that were a part of segregation in the South of the United States. It was an opposition to that whole constellation, that whole series of practices that was the target. So in trying to protest against that, civil disobedience is a practice that breaks the law in order to raise consciousness and bring about a change in the law. And when I say that the nature of the society is important, it's because civil disobedience is a process that wants to bring about political change. But of course, the important thing is that it only works if that society is capable of being transformed. So, if a society is completely tyrannous, is very repressive, then of course civil disobedience isn't going to work, because those who are protesting publicly are going to disappear very quickly. So that sort of tactic doesn't have any success. It's counterproductive in a society that is completely closed politically, in which there is no political freedom whatsoever. It only works in a society where there is some aspect of political freedom. On the other hand, of course, if a society were perfectly democratic, then there would be no need for civil disobedience, because you could make your voice heard in the public forum and expect to be taken seriously in the public forum and to have your arguments rationally evaluated. Civil disobedience presupposes that is not the case, that for some reason there is a blindness, perhaps a prejudice on the part of the majority. Perhaps they are incapable of considering a question unless it is brought forth in this very confrontational way that civil disobedience entails. So that's why the nature of society is important. If society is completely closed, civil disobedience won't work. And if society is completely open, civil disobedience is not necessary. Now, of course, no society is completely open in that sense, and it's an ideal. So that it always presupposes that societies are somewhere in between, completely closed and completely open, if it's to be successful. So the purpose, it tries to bring about a political change. It breaks the law for a political purpose. It breaks the law to achieve a moral political purpose, and that's what makes it different from criminal activity, which of course is also law breaking. Criminal activity is done for a self-interested, selfish purpose. Civil disobedience is done for a political, moral purpose. For the reasons that it does have this place between completely closed and open societies, we can think of it perhaps as an intermediate stage, a stage in between persuasion and revolution. If we think of persuasion as the attempt to raise one's argument in political debate, to make your case in political debate through the media, through open channels, through legal protest. And remember, legal protest is a different thing than civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is breaking the law to get a point across. Revolution would be, the other extreme, which wants to overturn society and the laws as a whole. Civil disobedience doesn't have that aspiration. It only wants to change a particular law or a particular group of laws. It doesn't want to change the society as a whole. So there's no implication in civil disobedience that society as a whole is corrupt. There is just an isolated problem or a particular blind spot or a particular issue that needs addressing. But it's different from both revolution, which is more extreme, and persuasion, which relies on making an argument within the ordinary accepted channels of political debate. So it has an intermediate stage between those two.